Move on to the panel. Ben, you're going to stay with us for the panel. So let me welcome onto stage Anna Ford, who's on the board of Sainsbury's, and as we've heard is the corporate responsibility supremo on the board, and Neil Sachdev, the property director of the group, who was 28 years at Tesco before joining Sainsbury's in 2007, so has that experience.
I think we've just about beaten it out of him now.
Yeah. I'm going to take questions from the podium, so it's easier for me to identify people. So if you'd like to raise a hand, and there are microphones moving around the room for those who'd like to pose questions to anyone on the panel. I'm also trying to keep an eye on what's coming up on the hashtag GMSains for anyone who's watching us and like to ask any questions from home. So this is your chance to ask anyone on the panel any question that you think has been not addressed so far, or indeed go into more detail on those that have. Who'd like to start? Right at the back there, with shirt sleeves. And if you could say who you are and who you represent, so that they can gauge their answers.
Very good. My name is Paul Dickinson from Carbon Disclosure Project. My question is, how can Sainsbury's help the government respond appropriately to climate change?
Justin, you like to take that?
Well, could you just elaborate on the question? I mean, what do you have in mind?
Well, practically every relevant scientific authority assures the public that no government is responding at an appropriate scale to climate change. So there seems to be a systemic problem with democracy. Sainsbury's has millions of customers and a huge public outreach. How might Sainsbury's help the government respond as the scientific community demand they do?
Yeah, I'm just, the first thing I pick up is I'm not sure. I mean, it's clear that democracies find difficult and challenging decisions which are not vote winners in the short term more challenging than do totalitarian regimes. I'm not sure there's any evidence at all that totalitarian regimes deliver better environmental sustainability. So I think we should sort of put the kind of politics of the question to one side for a second. I think that, in the end, this will be driven by consumers who are also voters. Voters vote once every 5 years or so in most democracies. Almost all of the issues that we're talking about need timelines that are greater than 5 years to address them. How businesses like us therefore help is by giving politicians confidence in what our customers are saying day to day, by taking them on a journey in, if you like, the right direction. It's back to my point about the 2020 targets. The direction of travel on most of the targets today, if extrapolated forward in a straight line, won't get us to the targets that we've set, nor should they, because they wouldn't be stretching if it just required us to keep cranking the handle on what we've already done. But we are travelling in a direction, and we're doing that because our customers are telling us that's the direction that they want us to travel in. And to Andrew's earlier question, we're happy to be a step ahead of that. I do not subscribe to the view that we only respond as retailers, as corporations, when customers get there. That's rot. All successful corporations have had their most successful moments when they've got ahead of customers, but a step or two ahead of customers, because that's where competitive advantage lies. So how we help the government is by giving them confidence that they are on the right agenda to ultimately win votes, because that's their agenda. That is their agenda. Every politician will tell you that there's no point standing for something if they're not in power. And that therefore what they want to know is that things that they say they are going to do have a chance of being in line with where consumers are, voters are, when it comes time to vote. And I think the fact we get to test that every week, 22 million times over, more people vote with their wallet in Sainsbury's every week than voted for the current government one day 2.5 years ago. That's a powerful democratic mechanism which we can share with politicians.
Anna, you wanted to take a...
Yeah, I mean,
view
it
on
was a political question. I think I'd like to answer it in a political way, in that I feel there is an enormous apathy with politics today. The turnout in the last election was appalling. It may be even worse than the next general election. But my perception is, as I've travelled not just around this country but around the world, that there is a great appetite now for bottom-up politics, not top-down politics, where people are beginning to say, not why don't they do something about it, but why don't we do something about it? And I think that when you get places like transition towns and Totnes doing remarkable things in sustainability in the whole of one town, and then you get cities like Manchester saying they might become a transition town, you see the effect of people working together. Now, we have had government ministers to our dinners, and the dinners are held under Chatham House rules, and we've been able to say things and discuss things with them that perhaps wouldn't have been talked about in a more open way, because, as Justin quite rightly says, politicians want to get re-elected. But it's up to us to change the political system and to make it more sustainable. I hope that Justin is, when he sits on the Prime Minister's Business Committee, occasionally saying these things, sotto voce or not sotto voce. But I do feel the power is now with the people and the consumer. I've seen this in Latin America very effectively, where groups of women have set up cooperatives and have taken pieces of land eventually from some of the big landowners and turned it into very effective cooperatives. And there's a sort of tipping point happening today, which I feel after 10 years of feeling very depressed about politics, I suddenly feel less depressed than I did last year.
Okay, another question from the floor. Who'd like to weigh in? A gentleman there with the...
Hello. Hello, my name is Wouter van Tol from Nestlé. First of all, I think it's brilliant that you're doing this. You're opening up yourself to criticism, which is brave and confident, and I just think that's a fantastic thing to do, so thank you. My question is for the whole panel, and when I was reading the report that we've all had, there were some really contradictory things in there. I was particularly struck in the carbon section. Some people saying, oh, Sainsbury's, you're doing fantastically well. Other people saying, well, this is really behind the curve. There were a few other examples like that as well. So I'd like to give you the opportunity to, instead of being criticized, to criticize us and tell us what you think of our wisdom as a crowd, and please be brutally honest.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. It's a good question, because there are always going to be contradictions, because businesses want to grow. And therein lies a contradiction. If you're growing, you must be causing damage. The way we've chosen to do this, certainly around carbon, is we want to grow whilst actually reducing our total carbon emissions. So to give you an example of it, we've grown our space by 25% over the last 4 years. We've reduced our absolute carbon emissions by 9%. Now, one of the ways we're achieving that is by growing. Justin talked about competition. But what we're doing through our development program is we're investing in new technologies by doing that. That's allowing us to experiment a little bit more and allowing us to do new things that were previously just unheard of and not possible. An example of that recently is we've got geothermal. We've signed up to do a number of stores over the few years. Now, thankfully, Mother Nature gave us an earth that is constantly warm below ground, and we've not used that. And what we're trying to do is use geothermal, but more importantly, using the fridges that we already have in our stores that produce heat by putting that heat back into the ground and therefore increasing the temperature, and using that as using the mechanical and the electrical charges that go in there to heat our stores and heat our water with, and therefore almost going to zero on that. So I think there are contradictions, but it depends on how one uses those contradictions to drive change. The other area that we're starting to create change is we're creating new technologies, which, by the way, is creating new jobs. And it's starting to create a new apprentice scheme. So we are training 20,000 colleagues by 2020 to understand what is it that they can do in the carbon world. I'm talking the technological world, and we're turning them into apprentices and hopefully champions about how you go about making change happen in the carbon arena. So that's where the opportunity is, and therefore it's raising awareness as well around the world, and certain stress around the world, because we're talking to a company in China this morning who found out about geothermal and said, can you please tell us some more about it, because we may want to do that, because we're just starting up.
Justin, how do you tackle the contradictions in the feedback that you're...
Well, I think it would be completely staggering if you asked 200 people with a point of view and they aligned around a centre of gravity. So I think that I would absolutely expect that our performance on every single issue would cause some people in the room to accuse us of being the worst in the world, and some to say that, in truth, we're the best in the world, depending on your perspective. Therefore, I don't see that really as a contradiction. I think there is a truth about all of this issue, which is that there are no absolutely right answers. And actually, I would make a point about absolutism more generally, which is that I think it's really, really unhelpful in engaging consumers more generally. Consumers have to believe it's worth making the change. And part of the problem on this issue, I believe, has been if you articulate it at being such a scale and so impossible to solve that individual consumers don't think what they can do is worthwhile, the natural human response is to disengage. We've got to get this issue into that, into the Mao Zedong space. It's a journey of 1,000 miles, and it starts with a single step. And we have to articulate it in those terms if consumers are going to come on the journey.
Just to go very micro then for a second, because there's a question come in on the web for Neil, I think, following on from your point about the fridges. When are you going to put doors on the chilled sections? Neil, that's it to Justin. Justin, back to Neil.
No. We've looked at it. We've trialled it in a number of stores. We're trying to work out the best way of doing this, because there are places... We're being led by customers on a lot of these things. So one of the things that when we did our store at Greenwich, we actually put doors in to start with. And one of the feedback that came from customers was, look, you're making it difficult for us to shop. And that's partly where it is. And I think there is a customer change we need to go through. Having said that, all our frozen food has doors in it. So we've made that change. And we're now starting to look at certain areas where putting doors in will work. Doors is a bit of a fallacy as well, because if you've got high moving volume coming out of a fridge, the door's going to stay open all the time. There is no advantage. If anything, we're likely to end up with more accidents because the door's going to stay open all the time. So I don't think that's the answer. The answer is to try and deal with what happens with the cold air that's coming out of there. But also, we're one of the first retailers, I think, in the world, I'm sure somebody will correct me here, we chose about 4 years ago to take all global warming gases out and replace them with CO2, which is a natural gas for refrigeration. The problem with most of these, it was in Rio, I think, in the 90s, in the 70s rather, when we were trying to deal with the ozone depleting gases. Somebody decided that we should get rid of all the ozone depleting gases and replace them with global warming gases. It clearly made sense then, but then we weren't aware of the consequence of that plan. What we decided was we were going to go to a natural gas. And a natural gas, the beauty about CO2 is every time we release one, and all of you here will know, every time we release one particle of CO2 out of a CO2 plant, it's one particle of CO2. Whereas a global warming gases, it was 1,000 parts of CO2. So that's where the challenge is. I think just putting doors in isn't really where it is. There's lots of other things for us to do first.
Okay, take another question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Kieran Mayers from Sony. It's excellent, of course, an organisation such scale being so progressive, even if marginally so. But you must be facing, like we are, a panacea of government regulation, and quite often misguided, and frustratingly so, because if you're trying to be progressive, you're doing well on these things, and then government can make a real hash of things. I'm thinking, for example, of the carbon reduction commitment. Do you have any traction? Do you find, as business leaders, if you speak with the government, that they actually will listen to you to put these things right? Because we find it quite often frustrating to get engagement and things moving in the right direction, even when you're actually trying to be progressive.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very big subject. And I mean, I like to think as an individual, although I'm very clear that my responsibility is to the organisation that I represent, that by being part of an organisation that has some marginal credibility on this subject, it empowers us to have a voice. And my experience is that if you speak from a position of strength, that politicians, at least behind closed doors, do listen because you're a credible voice. And back to my earlier point about votes, they do recognise that our customers are their voters. So it is a strong voice. But that said, this issue, and to some extent the doors are a great example of this, there are quite a lot of things that get bandied around, and politicians in particular like grabbing them as iconic examples of how something can be done, because politicians love to say something must be done. They're not so good at connecting the something that must be done to the ill or bad it is purporting to address. And that's where we, corporations, you in the audience, must hold up the mirror in the legislative process and say, it's great that you're engaging on this issue, but actually the things that you're proposing won't address this issue. Here's some things that could. They're probably more difficult, they're probably more long-term, they're less iconic, but actually will genuinely address the issue, if indeed your concern on the issue is genuine. And that's, I think, what we all have to do. But it's not easy stuff, because too many of these things are iconically grabbed, when in truth they're not really significant in terms of the issue that they purport to address.
The lady at the back with blonde hair there. Yes, standing up.
Thank you. Emma Howard-Boyd from Jupiter Asset Management. I wanted to hear a little bit from Justin about the journey he's taking his investors on around the sustainability strategy, and to see whether it's reached a time where more, arguably, can be communicated to investors about sustainability.
Truthfully, they never ask. I'm often asked, how do you explain, I've often been asked, how did you explain the investment you made in fair trade bananas to investors? I didn't know the answer to the question because I'd never been asked it, therefore never had to explain it to an investor. But in truth, probably wouldn't, even if asked it. Investors don't run companies, they invest in companies, and ultimately they should be investing in the decision-making of a management team and the results that decision-making delivers. And what I do believe is that there is a body of evidence growing that businesses which take a long-term and sustainable view deliver better returns for investors in the long term. That, by the way, opens up a whole question about whether investors, viewed as a body, as a whole body, are long-term investors, but that's perhaps for a whole other conference. But what we do know from talking to our investors, people that have their money or the money that they invest on behalf of others in our shares, is that there is an increasing belief on their part that there is a connection between this agenda and our focus on it and the consistent and long-term outperformance that our business has achieved. So the irony is that the point that they start asking the question is probably the time I'll get worried, because it means they'll be questioning whether indeed there is a linkage. As long as they're not asking the question, probably just means they're accepting it, and that's why they're invested in the company. So I'm not, back to the subject of what I lose sleep over, I don't lose sleep over the fact that investors don't ask me the question, but I do think it's encouraging that they're starting to see that there probably is a linkage.
Do you think that you've got to the point yet where there is the same virtuous circle of investors seeing the long-term benefits and therefore investing for the long-term benefits, as there is, for example, as Ben's described it, with suppliers in that relationship?
Oh, I think we're a long, long way from that. I think you, not only would it be stretching the point, I don't think you could get close to identifying any element of differential valuation today specifically attributed to sustainability strategies.
So if you missed a quarter...
In our sector, but I do believe in some sectors, I mean mining I think would be a specific example where the issues of sustainability and ethics more generally, I think, are writ more large, I think you could absolutely see that the PE multiples, that those that are believed to be at whatever the good end of the spectrum is in mining, are enjoying a premium for that.
But if you missed a quarter, a target, on a financial target, would the sustainability programme be a hostage to that?
Well, not as long as the current leadership team in Sainsbury's are in place, because we believe quite deeply that it is the core to our competitive advantage. But that's no different from any other strategic long-term investment you make. The biggest mistake that most management teams make is allowing short-term challenges to deflect them from doing the right things in the long term. Sometimes that is an absolute practical necessity. You know, saving, there are a number of long-term things that we were not able to do in the early days of the turnaround of Sainsbury's. Not least, 1 in 4 people in the Sainsbury's, as it was called then, head office, were made redundant. I mean, you know, it's deeply against the values of our organisation, but it was a necessary step in the journey of turning the business around. So I think it would be a naive and, in fact, a flat lie to claim that there won't be times that your short-term decision-making has to be counterproductive. But it is, sometimes you do have to cut off arms to save bodies.
Okay, lots of questions. I'm going to try and get through a few of them. Sorry, 2 more questions. Microphone in the middle there.
Hi, Nancy Hophouse, Barclays. My question is, you're talking about collaboration and how that's one of your drivers. And I was wondering how, as Sainsbury's, you embrace this and lead this while keeping your competitive edge?
Well, I talked about collaboration alongside competition, and broadly speaking, I believe the dynamic with our competitors is a competitive dynamic. The reason we took the decision to have our competitors here is because we think it is competitively a good thing to have our competitors in the room. Because if our competitors genuinely come to believe that this is on our customers' agenda, they'll compete on this subject. And if they compete on this subject and we keep doing the job that we think we're doing and open up the gap so that you believe there's genuinely a big gap, that's great news for our business, and that's the competitive dynamic of work. As I said, there'll sometimes be occasions where competition needs to kind of come to a conclusion, if you like, through collaboration, and multiple traffic light labelling, I think, is an example of where the competitive dynamics probably largely exhausted the journey now of engaging customers on the issue. I have no doubts that every retailer would not be in the same place as they broadly are now today had there not have been competition on the journey. But even if the retailers do collaborate, there are still 50% of everything that's sold in the UK, represented by some of the people in the room here today, which isn't close to being on this turf yet, because you haven't seen a major branded manufacturer say they're going to come and join this particular collaboration yet. So it has its place, but ultimately collaboration, I think, is at its most powerful, as demonstrated by Ben and the many examples like Ben within supply chains.
Anna?
Well, I'm a child of the 60s, so collaboration, cooperation versus competition were very much part of our conversation back then. But I think cynically, when the history realised that too much collaboration can lead to all sorts of problems with the OFT and the Competition Commission, as we've had some experience of. But on the collaborative front, I would say we take it much wider than just collaborating with our competitors, that we collaborate within our communities incredibly effectively. I mean, our colleagues raised the biggest ever cheque for comic relief, £11 million, which they gave to them last year. And that's collaboration on a massive scale. We have some police stations in some of our stores. We have homework clubs in some of our stores. We collaborate with the Boy Scouts and the Girl Guides movement. We collaborate very, very effectively within communities as to what particular charities they want to support. So collaboration can be across the board. It's a way of thinking. And what I've always liked about Sainsbury's has been that there has been this collaborative way of thinking within a highly competitive business.
Take one last question. Yes, lady here with the red hair.
Hello, good evening. It's Kate Bull from the People's Supermarket. A criticism that a lot of the big four supermarkets get is that they have negative effects on high streets and small local businesses. And often they are considered that when they move in, they just take over. How would Sainsbury's respond to that accusation?
Well, I think there is little evidence that that is in fact true. In fact, quite the opposite is true, and we can point to legion evidence. Probably the most high-profile campaign we've ever had against a Sainsbury's store was a local store we opened in Barnes, in a road called White Hart Lane in Barnes. A massive campaign. It became a political issue because it was essentially the clarion call of Zach Goldsmith's election campaign, ultimately successful election campaign. In the end, 5,000 people in the local community signed a petition after, by the way, the store had already got planning permission. Almost nobody had objected to it before it getting planning permission. About 22,000 customers a week shop in that shop. It's been open for 3 years. And I think you would struggle to find a local trader that says anything other than the best day for them was the day that Sainsbury's opened its door. It's regenerated and reinvigorated that high street. We've opened 49 convenience stores in the last 6 months, and I am very confident that every single one of those net has a positive impact. However, competition is a powerful thing. If we bring a better store with fresh food at cheaper prices, with better opening hours and fantastic customer service, are some other businesses going to find that difficult competition? And might that competition actually stop them from trading? I'm not going to duck that. Of course it will. That's what happens with competition. In the end, customers vote with their wallets. They choose where they spend their money, and we have nothing to apologise for as a business in terms of the impact we're having in high streets up and down the country. We are today, Sainsbury's, the biggest investor in high streets in the UK, bar none.
Well, I think we have to leave it there on this particular section so we can move on to the discussion which Jim is going to introduce. But let me just thank Justin and the panellists for their open contributions. Thank you.